Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his essay, To Philosophize is to Learn How to Die, Michel de Montaigne is going to suggest an overarching practice for us that can help us to move ourselves away from the fear of death, which he says is going to really cut into our possibility of having a good life, of tranquility, of the better kind of pleasure. And so what is he going to advise us to do? He says we must learn to stand firm and to fight against this fear. And he says to begin depriving death of its greatest advantage over us. Let us adopt a way clean contrary to that common one. Most people are trying not to think about death, and they are trying to avoid it as much as possible, to forestall it in some way. And Montaigne says, no, that you need to go the opposite direction. Let us deprive death of its strangeness, its case of being something étrange, something foreign, something strange to us. Make it something familiar instead. And so he's going to go on and tell us, let us frequent it, right? Let us become familiar with it. Let us get used to it. Accoutumance, right? Develop a custom of being connected with death. And so how do we do this? Well, he tells us that let us have nothing more often in mind than death. Now that is a very difficult thing to do since we have so many things to think about. Perhaps that would be a little bit too much to demand, but it is something that we can strive for, at least to some extent. We can say, I'm going to think about death every single day. I'm going to think about death in the places where I usually don't think about it. So he tells us at every instant, let us evoke it in our imagination under all of its aspects. And it gives us some examples here that can be useful. Whenever a horse stumbles, a tile falls, or a pin pricks, however slightly, let us at once chew over this thought, supposing that was death itself. Maybe the horse would kick and kill you, or perhaps the pin would poison you, or the tile falls and it hits you on the head, which happened to people in antiquity and presumably in Montaigne's own time. It still happens today sometimes, right? So he says, with that, let us brace ourselves and make an effort. So there's a lot of places that we can do this, and he tells us that it's particularly important when we're enjoying ourselves, when we're feeling good. He tells us, in the midst of joy and feasting, let our refrain be one which recalls our human condition. And what is our human condition? We're all going to die sooner or later. Let us never be carried away by pleasure. And remember, he distinguished earlier in the text not just between lower, voluptuous pleasures, but also between the pleasures that come from virtue itself, a good kind of pleasure. Let us not be so immersed in our pleasures that we fail to recall occasionally how many are the ways in which that joy of ours is subject to death. or how many are the fashions in which death threatens to snatch it away. So this is not obsessively thinking about one kind of death. Ooh, I'm going to drown. I got to think about drowning all the time. No, it's all the different ways we could die. And you might say, well, that's really morbid. And Montaigne would say, no, actually, the fear and the avoidance of death, that's what's actually morbid. That's what gives death this power over us. This is the way to wean ourselves away from that. And he gives the example of Egyptians bringing into banquets and good cheer a mummified corpse. Why? It's sort of and you may know this phrase, memento mori, something that reminds us of the fact that we are going to die. And a little bit later, he's going to start talking about the fruits that this gives us. He says that to practice death, and now, interestingly, the term that's translated as practice is premeditation, le premeditation de mort, right? The thinking on death in advance, or meditating on it in advance if you prefer to be very literal. Practicing death is practicing freedom. Premeditating on death helps us to understand freedom that we can have. And he goes on and says, a person who's learned how to die has unlearned how to be a slave or a servant, how to literally serve another. And he goes on and says, what are we freeing us of by knowing how to die? Subjection and constraint. And these are just transliterations of the French terms that are being used there. So he's got a really great proverb here. Life has no evil for him who has thoroughly understood that loss of life is not an evil, right? And he tells us that it's true that in all things, if nature does not lend a hand, art and industry don't progress very far. So some of this may have to do with temperament. And Montaigne himself is going to tell us about his own temperament and experience. He says, I am not so much melancholic as an idle dreamer. From the outset, there was no topic I ever concerned myself with more than with thoughts about death, even in the most licentious period of my life, right? When he's enjoying himself the most. He says, among the games and the courting, many thought I was standing apart, chewing over some jealousy or the uncertainty of my aspirations. I was actually reflecting on someone or another who, leaving festivities just like these, had been surprised by a fever, and his end with his head full of idleness, love, and merriment, just like me, and that the same could be happening to me. So he says, I'm thinking about death a lot, reflecting on death frequently. And he says, thoughts such as these did not furrow my brow any more than others did. And you might say, well, again, this is morbid. And Montaigne says, well, that's not my experience. My experience, which could be your experience, is something very different. At first, it does seem impossible not to feel the sting of these ideas. But if you keep handling them and running through them, you will eventually tame them. If that wasn't the case, he says, then I would have been in continual terror and frenzy, right? But that wasn't the case. So this is that getting used to it that's involved in this practice of depriving death of its strangeness, making death something familiar to us. So that's an important aspect. He goes on and he's going to give us some practices and reflections that may be very helpful. So here's one of them. In truth, risks and dangers do little or nothing to bring us nearer to death. Now, that's not saying that you should be careless or foolish or anything like that, but you could die at any time. So it's not as if by taking a trip down a river where perhaps the boat could founder and you could drown, you're at a much greater chance of dying than just walking around your apartment. He says that if we think about the millions of threats which remain hanging over us, apart from the one which happens to appear most menacing just now, we will realize that death is equally near when we are vigorous or feverish at sea or at home in battle or repose. You can try to make yourself as safe as possible. You could die of radon poisoning coming up through your basement. Or you could trip and fall and crack your head on the counter in your beautiful, super safe home in your gated neighborhood. Pick whatever else you want, right? So risks and dangers, we're always in risks and dangers. He's got a practice or set of practices that he talks about, and these have to do with, we might say, taking on too much and not being ready for death at any moment. He's got this great metaphor of, as far as we possibly can, we must always have our boots on, ready to go. Now, does that mean that you have to sleep with your boots on in the bed? No. He's not saying that. It's a metaphor, right? But we should always be prepared. He says we should also take care to have no outstanding business with anyone else, right? And he gives some interesting examples here. He says, one man complains less of death itself than at cutting short the course of a fine victory. Another that he has to depart before marrying off his daughter or arranging the education of his children. One laments the company of his wife, another of his son, as though they were the principal attributes of their being. And he says, well, maybe consider before you take on any sort of projects whether you're really going to be able to see them through. He says, we ought not plan anything on a large scale, at least not if we're to get all worked up if we cannot see it through the end. And he's, says, I want death to find me planting my cabbages, neither worrying about it nor the unfinished gardening. So it is possible to take on all sorts of projects. Just be aware that you might have to leave them unfinished. And he brings up another example of a man who, right to the last, kept lamenting that destiny had cut the thread of the history he was writing when he'd only gotten up to our 15th or 16th king. Right? So he'd already got a lot done, but he didn't finish the task that he really wanted to do. And so it's a big problem. Well, it doesn't have to be if you put things into the proper perspective, and so that's one important practice. Another is this, he doesn't use the word memento mori, but it's effectively that. He says, our graveyards have been planted next to churches. Why? So that women, children, and lesser folk should grow accustomed to seeing a dead man without feeling terror, and that this continual spectacle of what? Of the things that pertain to death, bones, tombs, and funerals, should do what? Should frighten us? No, to remind us of the human condition, that we are mortal, and that sooner or later we will join the rest of those who have died. Actually, so will everybody else that we care about. So this can be quite helpful, and he once again brings up the Egyptians displaying before their guests a huge portrait of death held up by a man crying, drink and be merry, once dead you will look like this. And he talks about his own practice of not just having death in his mind, but on his lips. Hearing about somebody dying, he's like, hey, did he die well? Did he die poorly? What were the circumstances? And Montaigne's recommending this as a way of, again, becoming familiar with death. Now, somebody could say, well, that's all great in theory, but when it comes to the end, the reality, in French, effet, right? The effect of actually facing death, this is not going to actually work for you. He's got this great metaphor. He says that when we actually get there, all our fine fencing, escrime, right? You fight fencing with a sword, amounts to nothing. And he says, well, if people want to say that, go ahead and say that, but I'll tell you this. There's no doubt that premeditation, on death confers advantages. And he says, even if it doesn't, is it nothing to get even that far without faltering or feverish agitation. Let's say you, in the end, do panic. You do get all upset. Still, you lived a life where you didn't have to be afraid of dying all the time, and it didn't have to ruin your enjoyment of things. And then he's got this interesting observation, which he backs up in a couple different ways. He says, nature herself lends a hand and gives us courage. So how does that do so? Well, if our death, he says, is violent and short, we don't have any time to be afraid. And then you have courage, right? And he says, if it's otherwise, I've noticed that as an illness gets more and more hold on me, I naturally slip into kind of a contempt for life. And he also tells us that nature kind of eases us along over the course of our life. He says, if any of us were to be plunged into old age all of a sudden, I don't think we could handle that. But almost imperceptibly, nature leads us by the hand down a gentle slope, little by little, step by step. She engulfs us in that pitiful state, and she breaks us in. So we feel no jolt when youth dies in us, though in essence and in truth, that's a harsher death than the total extinction of a languishing life as old age dies. It's not so grievous a leap from a wretched existence to non-existence as it is from sweet existence in full bloom to one full of travail and pain. So nature is going to help us out as well. And he's got this great line that we'll close with here. He's talking about Socrates' own example. So he's being threatened, right? Socrates was told that the 30 tyrants had condemned him to death. He retorted, well, and nature has condemned them. We're all going to die. So if we actually make ourselves familiar with death, if we frequent it, if we get used to it, if we deprive it of its strangeness, then the fear of death, which is such a plague for so many people, doesn't have to be so for us.